Hi, everyone. It's Carolyn Moore with the Widow Empowerment Event Virtual. And I'm so excited to share Heather Leathers with you. I met Heather in 2016 when we were at a United Nations, actually meeting with Lord Lumba for the launch of the Global Widows Report. And that event was, and I'm sure Heather will share with you on her presentation, truly life altering. It literally changed the trajectory of my life. I had not at that point in time realized how many global widow advocates there were around the world who actually were convening together to be heard. Heather will share, she works with widows around the world, and I'm going to share with you her resume, because I'm increasingly impressed with what Heather is doing. I really feel like us meeting was a predestined moment where you need to find other people who really care. Heather's not a widow, but she advocates for widows as if she was one of us. And it just, I would love to hear your story and how you actually started, Heather. But Heather, wave, and I'm gonna read your resume, and then I'm gonna give you the whole platform here. So Heather is the president and the founder of the Global Fund for Widows. And you're going to learn what that is on this call. She has raised millions of dollars towards the little known and overlooked root source of global poverty, which is widowhood. In addition to economically empowering over 14,000 widows in the developing world, Heather has innovated a financial inclusion platform that is bringing banks to the world's poorest and most vulnerable. For this groundbreaking work, she has been awarded the Business Council of Peace Women Forward, a Financial Catalyst Award in 2020. Global Fund for Widows impact extends to Egypt, India, Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Malawi, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic. In addition to accomplishments in the field, Heather has met with various policymakers through her advocacy at the United Nations Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the US Congress, the Department of State, and the House of Lords. Because of the far-reaching impact that widowhood has on developing society and economies, Heather has been acknowledged by the Egyptian government as successfully combating terrorism at its source by sustaining families. Just think about it. Heather has published extensively on the intrinsic link between inheritance rights, human rights, poverty, and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and advises governments on mechanisms for financing development. You also, I believe, had a degree from University of Pennsylvania in economics, which you didn't even put on there, but it's hard to say. So we're talking to a woman who understands the poverty and how it's connected to widowhood, and how if widowhood is basically unaddressed, then we're going to have a problem being successful at any of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a mouthful. But you are about to be impressed. Thank you, Heather, for being on this call. And I am so excited that you're actually educating our community. Heather and I meet once a month now, because we realize now that our community and her global connections all need to be talking to all of us. And so thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And really, I mean, we have known each other for many years now, 4 years after meeting at the United Nations. And we've always thought about Modern Widows Club and the force that you guys are and the power that you are. And I'm so honored to be able to take your power and all of your voices and merge it with the voices that I represent around the world, and really create change. The time is now. International Widows Day was great because we presented in 4 different webinars across the world, and I actually was quoted a couple of times because I finally said something that I had never been able to say before. Widows, tell your story. The world has stopped to listen. This is our moment. And so with that, I'm grateful for the opportunity to explain widowhood in the global context, and then to ask for your advice and to ask for your partnership in this journey. I'm grateful for Carolyn's, partnership, and we continue to look forward to changing the world. And I have some ideas, which I'll share at the end. So the issue of widowhood is global. There are a minimum of 300 million widows in the world today, and they care for approximately 500 million children. One of the things that complicates the issue of widowhood and why it's remained invisible for so long is that in order to understand it, really, we need to understand the definition of a widow. And that's really where the problem begins. There's first the issue of the de facto widow, whose husband is in fact deceased. It sounds simple enough, but how do you define husband? Well, in the developing world, next slide, please. In the developing world, or in our world, here in the Western global North, as we call it, there's, in order to be married, you have to have a marriage certificate. And that marriage certificate allows you to collect the death certificate. But in the developing world, in the global South, that's not how marriages are consummated. Marriages are consummated either culturally, in a cultural ceremony, or a religious ceremony, or in some kind of informal union. And if it's a child bride, which 30% of the developing world is still getting married as under the age of 18, then there is no commemoration. There is no marriage certificate. It's not a registered marriage. So when the husband actually dies, the widow doesn't even know what a death certificate is or a marriage certificate. She cannot use that marriage certificate to claim her rights and secure the death certificate. If she doesn't have the death certificate, she's a persona non grata and has absolutely no rights to inheritance. So that's the de facto widow. Then we have something that I call the functional widow. She acts as a widow, but the truth is that her husband has abandoned her. Sometimes it could be voluntarily, but most of the time it's involuntarily. Possibly this could have been due to the impact of state actors, maybe in war where the government abducted the husband. Or it could be non-state actors, such as ISIS or Boko Haram, who've abducted the husband and there's no record of whether or not he's alive, if he's dead. In situations like this, at what point do we relieve the widow of her marriage in order to allow her to even be eligible for inheritance? And then the last is the hardest one to really get my head around, but is important, and we've included it in our definition when we've been lobbying Congress for this, is the forced marriage widow. When terrorist groups abduct young women, such as Boko Haram abducting Nigerian schoolgirls, they take those girls and they bring them to their camps, and then they forcibly marry them. So when the girls return, when they're released or when they escape, we celebrate that these girls have returned and we call them returnees. But the truth of the matter is that they're actually widows. I have in my network widows who are 13, 12, and 10. And the truth of the matter is that we don't recognize that marriage. I would never recognize that marriage, but it doesn't matter what you and I think. What matters is what's happening in her community. And in her community, she is a ISIS widow or she's a Boko Haram widow. She has bad blood and she cannot reinstate into society. And that's very damaging. That's a death sentence for the widow. So there's also, next slide, please. There's also an issue of magnitude. And when we go around the world advocating for widows, we show them this one statistic. In acts of war, the percentage of widowhood increases dramatically. So for example, in Syria, 80% of the female population is widowed. In Afghanistan, 45%. In Iraq, 47%. And in Rwanda, 72%. there's a massive amount of widows in these war-torn or recovering countries that have no rights to inheritance or property or assets. And that's something that we also need to be cognizant of as we hold hands and try to address this issue. Another problem with widowhood, if you skip to the next slide, please, is that we have all these preconceived notions, and I was guilty when I started the organization 12 years ago of the same preconceived notions. I literally thought to myself, I would help a couple of grandmas in my native Egypt, and I would feel good about myself. And that's really kind of what I started doing, or what I thought I would be doing. The truth of the matter is, as a finance geek and as an economics geek, we went in and we started taking surveys immediately of all of the widows that were applying and were joining us. And what we realized very quickly is that the majority of widows were actually widowed under the age of 39. So in Egypt, 53% of our widows are widowed under the age of 39. And in Tanzania, 100% of my widows are widowed under the age of 39, which invariably means they are mothers of young children. In fact, more than half of them are supporting families of 3 or more, and 70% live under the poverty line. Almost all of them have experienced some form of disinheritance or some kind of family, cultural, or legal barrier to inheritance. And this is what I want to talk to you guys about today, disinheritance. So if you skip to the next slide, widows around the world endure 3 human rights violations. The first is this one of disinheritance. Disinheritance essentially means that that the widow's husband passes away, for example. The family, because in the developing world, the bride, usually the wife, usually lives in the husband's home. So the family will run out, collect the death certificate, and come back to her and say, "Who are you?" And she says, "What are you talking about? I'm your daughter-in-law. I've been living here for the last 20 years. We don't know who you are. Get out." She's evicted from the home. She is not able to access her rightful assets, her rightful estate, or even assets that she purchased during the marriage, worked during the marriage, or brought into the marriage. The second thing that she might not be able to do is keep her own identity, especially if she was married as a child. The family takes control of what we call critical papers. And so those critical papers that hold her birth certificate or any other legal identity form gets held up by the family, and she leaves without it. So she becomes a persona non grata, without an identity and without a nationality. She may or may not be able to inherit her own children. If she lives in a country where the son's rights to the inheritance are greater than her own right to inheritance, the family will hold on to the son and evict the mother. And lastly, if there was a dowry, or what we call a bride price, in place, the widow is considered property because she was purchased, and she will be inherited herself as part of the estate, usually to a father-in-law or a brother-in-law or some other male member next of kin. The second form of human rights violations against widows is discrimination. There is institutionalized discrimination across the board. 39 countries prohibit a widow from inheriting, period. And 102 countries have some form of legal, customary, social, red tape barrier, including our own, which prevent the widow from inheriting land or assets or social security or other social benefits. And then the last form of human rights violations that widows endure is probably one of the worst ones. It's called harmful traditional practices. And these consist of violent cleansing rites that are perpetrated on the widow, usually by the leadership of her village, of her town, wherever she lives. It's the chief who comes in and cleanses her of the sin of her husband's death. It is usually violent rape. It is usually has no statute of limitation, so it can happen for as long as he deems it right. It can be in the form of gang, and it is oftentimes what we're hearing out of our widows in Malawi is that they're being forced to pay for this privilege. So they're paying the chief, who's supposed to be keeping law and order, for the privilege of being raped to cleanse themselves of the sin of her husband's death. Awful. So what does this mean? Well, there are several implications to these 3 human rights violations, and we describe these in details when we try to talk to governments, and including our own here. What happens when the widow is disinherited is that she can no longer have any form of income. And then she loses her ability to service basic needs, including food, including healthcare, including the ability to educate her children. Because in the developing world, you have to pay your school fees on a monthly basis. If you don't have school fees that month, your kids don't go to school. And so immediately the children are forced to leave school as soon as the death occurs and the disinheritance occurs. Well, widows are desperate to protect their children. And so what happens to their daughters? Well, the widows look to child marriage in order to protect their daughters, because they feel that that's the best way that they can protect their daughters. And then the other thing is that sons who are removed from school become vulnerable to a life of crime and a life of radicalized indoctrination and extremist recruitment. And this is why we received so much approval from the Egyptian government, because we're working to sustain these families so that they don't become terrorist or extremist recruits. From discrimination, widows cannot access justice. Even the courts are set up to deny them their rights. The police forces will happily listen to their grievance and then take them into the back room to console them, rape them, drug them, and then sell them across the border. There is no economic opportunity. She doesn't have skills. She was probably married as a child. She has no opportunity for work, especially decent work. And she has no access to her papers. Oftentimes they become stateless. The last thing with harmful traditional practices, its implication is the spread of HIV/AIDS, obviously incredible violence, and then the risk of being drawn into the underworld of human trafficking or slavery. Well, what does this mean? I know that over the course of probably the last 2 days, Carolyn has done a really great job of explaining the Sustainable Development Goals that were established by the UN 25 years ago, or actually it was a little bit sooner. The Millennium Goals were established 25 years ago, but it's a set of 17 goals that we're trying to achieve by 2030. It includes the elimination of poverty, the elimination of inequality, the elimination of poor health, the elimination of poor education. There are all these really great noble endeavors that the UN is trying to achieve, and all of the countries have approved and ratified it. But the truth of the matter is that this graphic shows that without addressing the issue of widowhood, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because there are so many varied intersectionalities between all of these goals. So for example, if a widow is disinherited, then it moves us away from the first SDG of eliminating poverty, because she's immediately put into a state of poverty. And if there's another widow tomorrow that is disinherited, she too will be launched into a vicious cycle of poverty, and so on and so forth. Food insecurity, SDG 2, poor health, SDG 3. There are so many tragic intersectionalities, and this is addressing 12% of the population, the global population. 1.2, 1.3 billion people are impacted. And so unless we actually address the issue of widowhood, we cannot solve for the SDGs, and we've identified 12 out of the 17 SDGs that are impacted directly by widowhood. So what does the Global Fund for Widows do? Well, we do two things mainly. The first thing is that we build banks. As a former banker, I spent 16 years on Wall Street. I really truly believe in the golden rule. She who has the gold makes the rules. It's that simple. And so this really it guides our philosophy and programming in everything that we do. We designed a bank. We innovated a bank mostly because we found that microfinance around the world was not getting the job done. And so the bank that we innovated, we call the Widows Savings and Loan Association, and essentially, or WSALA for short. And essentially, we organize widows into groups of 25. And we ask them, how much will it cost in your country to start a small business so that you can live sustained? And on average, it costs about $100 per widow to completely transform her life. And so we say, okay, why don't you save $33, save 1/3 of that amount and come to the bank. And so when all of the widows in the group have saved that $33, we have them come and meet and we say, all right, you put your $33 in the bank. For every $33 that you put in, I'm going to give you 67. For every dollar you put in, I'm going to give you 2, which means all of a sudden the widow in her little bank has $100 that she now owns, and she can take that and go out and start her own small business. She owns the bank because she saved and she put that money in the box, and now she has a share that represents 1/25 or what her bank is worth. And then from there, the widows start meeting, and they borrow and they lend and they create insurance products within their little bank, and they create scholarship funds to send some of their kids to school. And they've been doing incredible things. Widows usually start these little banks with $2,500 because we give them that boost. But in about 4 or 5 years, the bank grows to about $10,000, $12,000. Imagine the financial catalyst. What we've also found from these widows is that once they become sustained, the first thing that they do is that they put their kids back in school. The first thing that they do. And then the second thing that they do is they spend more money on food. So that shows that they're increasing their nutrition. And then the other thing that they do is they improve the health of their family, the health and welfare of their family. And then when all of those bases have been covered, the widows start looking out. How can I help my community? And so we've had widows who have replaced the windows of churches. There are widows who have replaced walls and doors at the schools. We have widows who've decided that in our slum in Kenya, we don't have a grain mill. So we're going to put all of this profit that we have and buy a grain mill collaboratively, and then we're going to start charging people to mill our grain and then take that profit, and it's just a secondary business. So it's been incredibly powerful, incredibly catalytic. We have widows that are doing some really great businesses. Tanzania, all of our widows borrowed all of the money at once and went out and bought 75 goats, and they hired their sons to raise the goats as shepherds, and then they sold the goats and fattened them, and they made so much money that they all built extra rooms in their homes, and they bought cows and they started cow farms, which is not really, it's very untraditional and never heard of, and very, very empowering. The other thing that we do before my time is run up is that we also train these widows to become community paralegals. Now, mind you, most of these widows are not literate. And so what we do is we have them come in, and every 2 weeks they have to meet their bank partners anyway. And so during these 2-week meetings, we start sending in lawyers, and the lawyers will explain to them what the Constitution is and what their rights are. Disinheritance is illegal. Did you know that you have the rights to that house or that land or that property? Did you know that you cannot be violated in that way of harmful traditional practices, what the chief did to you? You have rights, you can send him to jail. These are the things that we're starting to educate our widows. And when our widows receive that training, we graduate them as community paralegals, and then they start training other people around them. Not necessarily widows, maybe it's their daughters, maybe it's their sons, maybe it's the pastor himself, but it's been incredibly powerful. And now we have chiefs who are actually coming to us and saying, how do we partner? How can we build more of these, because we have more widows and further on down the village that need your help. And it's been incredible. I'll skip the theory of change because it gets a little bit into the weeds, but it kind of, for anyone who wants to take a look at it, we can always talk about it a little bit more. But in my second to final slide, I wanted to show you the reaction of what happens when we enter into these banks and have the widows basically invest their $33 and receive the other portion. So if I can show you what the reaction was when we launched the first bank in Kenya. Cheryl, do you have the video?
Yeah, I think she's pulling it up. Videos are different.
Okay. Little savings bank. We're very blessed. We were very blessed to have this opportunity to see the first bank being invested in Kenya, and the widows were so joyful because it was the first time that anyone had ever given them an opportunity. So I'm very grateful for your audience. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we do. In addition to the work in the field, we also lobby. We do a lot of advocacy for these widows and trying to change laws. We're trying to change international law, but we're also finding that it's really important that our own Congress isn't even aware of what's happening in the world. When we talk to our congressmen, most of the time, and women, most of the time, they've never heard of the issue of widowhood. They've never heard of any of these human rights violations, and they almost don't believe me. And so it's time now. Like I said before, the world has stopped to listen. This is our moment, and we need to speak up. So if any of you have been inspired to help, I wanted to just share a few ways that we can help. The first is that we need to understand what disinheritance is, because it's actually not a word in the dictionary. We need to make it known, and we need to be able to identify it. So now you know what it is. And I think in your registration form, we asked a question whether or not you have been disinherited or if you know of anyone who's been disinherited. We also have this import of cultures from around the world that has started to manifest itself here in this country. We need to be able to see those. So if you know of anyone who's been disinherited, if you yourself have been disinherited, please reach out to me. We need that story. We need to be able to report this because Congress people need to know what's happening in their districts, and we need your partnership on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is join us and become an advocate. With Modern Widows Club, we are looking for volunteers to call and to write our politicians and other stakeholders like AARP, who has an international arm, and the deputy head of that arm wants to help us, wants to change the world for widows abroad, but the head won't let her take that action. And so we need that partnership. We need those voices. We need your advocacy with us. And then the final thing is we're a very small NGO. We're always looking for help. We need passionate people. We need talented people. We need people to either help us with advocacy, join me at the United Nations every year for the Commission on the Status of Women conference as part of our delegation, or you can join us in the field. We would love to have you come to Kenya, come to Egypt, come to Tanzania, help us start spreading the word. And so with that, I thank you so much for your audience. I'm blessed, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
So many questions. I went ahead and asked people to go ahead and post in the Q&A. You guys can imagine, I mean, I'm not often kind of left speechless, but when Heather, we got on the phone, she showed me this presentation, I truly went, okay, how are we going to get this knowledge into more heads and hearts? And this is that moment, right? It's like the moment where we went, hey, well, I'm having this virtual widow empowerment event. Why don't we have you come and talk? Because I think this is something that, well, all these things we learned through the Global Widows Report, you know, being in the room with widows who fly all the way to Cameroon, who are eating and living on the streets, just to be heard, the perspective gets very real. I didn't even feel worthy of speaking, being from the US, and but we all have different types of solutions. So the idea of banks is brilliant, because yes, financial freedom is, I think, what all people hope for, not just women. So one of the questions Christy had here was, what is a small business example? I mean, some people don't even know about, like, even Kiva organizations where you can give microfunds to widows, which I've been doing for years. You know, $25, they pay it back, you know, helps them buy seeds for food. Small, you know, you can go all the way, like you said, to Egypt and all that, whatever level in which you want to participate. Because one of the things, you know, Modern Widows Club and Global Fund for Widows, we're partnering. And that was one of the things I wanted to share, is it doesn't make sense to go alone. It makes sense to go together. And that's one of the things that we've been doing while we're committed to meet every month. So just share a little bit about, is there,
what are small businesses? What do they look like? It's a really great question. In Egypt, as a banker, my view is that I want the widows to be in an industry that just stays flat. It's called inelastic. That means if the economy is booming or crashing, they're not linked to the economy. They're not doing any sewing, and they're like competing with Chinese imports, and they're not doing any like little, I don't know, chalk cheese things to be sold at tourist sites. Yeah. I want them to be in the agricultural business and the food business, because every day somebody has to eat, and there will always be that buyer of food. And so we're always trying to look for that little sweet spot. And they don't have land, so they can't usually, for the most part, plant. So what we do is oftentimes they are able to rent a house or to find a house or live in their mother's house or their father's house sometimes. And so they build little chicken coops on their roof. And we train them. We have widows who have become chicken nurses, and they run around inoculating the chickens and making sure that all of them are healthy for market preparation. But we have thousands of widows who are raising chicken or duck, or in Egypt they eat pigeon. So that's an example of what they're doing. We have now interest in the widows using proceeds from their banks to buy greenhouses, so that they can actually, in a group, start, not really needing land, but being able to grow food vertically. And so we're really excited about that development. widows can raise goats. Widows have vegetable stands. In Malawi, we have widows that live by the lake. They buy the fish from the fishermen when they come off of the water, and we bought them freezers. So they are freezing their fish now and sending it into the marketplace, or they're drying their fish. Whatever it is, there's so many little businesses that they can do. Some become hairdressers, and some become manicurists, but those are the minority. We really try to focus on what gives them the full flexibility. There's one widow who I love. We helped her many years ago. She had 5 daughters, and she was disinherited, had nothing, and had to take all of these 5 daughters out of school. Well, we ended up supporting her, and she was able to start a small sandwich shop out of her home. And the farmers that were going to the fields near the Nile would swing by her house and start buying sandwiches. Well, when she got really popular, she realized that the farmers leave really early in the morning. They need their coffee and they want donuts. And so she started making donuts. She made so much money. She sent all 5 of her girls back to school and educated them, and now those girls are working. And so that gives you just the sense of the power of that economic empowerment, that little catalyst.
Yeah, it's just that beginning, right? And like in calls with Heather, we're like, we need to be talking to the Heifer International Organization, which is another company out of Arkansas that I would love to get connected with, because I grew up in Arkansas knowing about heifer, and it's like, give chicks to someone in poverty so they can grow chickens and have the eggs. And it really comes down to a meal for the day.
Yeah.
That's how basic we're talking about sustaining someone's life. And then the money that comes from that empowers her it builds her confidence, because now really all she wants to do is be able to provide for her kids. So that was a great example, Heather, of how something very, very a decision. We got a couple other questions. Thank you for posting how to get involved. I have been waiting to find a way to combine my grief blog into more advocacy for widows in the world. Katie Pettigrew. So she would just love to probably do an article or read more. You guys can go to the Global Fund for Widows website, and there's also I don't know if you guys realize it, but we have a Facebook page called the Widows Widow Advocacy Group. And so just type that in the search engine, and that's where we're going to start talking about some more advocacy ways. Heather just got into the group, but that's where really I think women who want to start stepping up their how they uniquely can contribute to advocacy. Let me sing. Be present. Credit unions are global, and their mission is serving the underserved. Consider reaching out to the World Council of Credit Unions.
Oh, that's a great idea. Can someone email that to me? I just put my name out on the chat. So reach out to me, and if you have those ideas, please reach out to me. And there's so many really wonderful responses. I'm getting emotional. It's beautiful, but find me, please. And
we'll get your information to all the people. And plus you can reach out to Heather from the website, and her in the handbook is her bio. So all her links are right there. So it's very easy to reach her. We won't be able to get together. We have about 7 more minutes, which is great. Let's see. How can we donate to support these widow enterprises?
That's so wonderful of you. Thank you so much for your charity and your generosity. There's a donate button on our webpage, globalfundforwidows.org, and you can donate directly there. Just to let you know, I have been working for free for the last 12 years. I have refused to take a paycheck because I just want all of the income that comes into the organization to go straight to the widows who need it the most. And so whatever donation you are making, it's going straight to the widows. I just feel very strongly that everyone know that, because I personally feel strongly about that myself. But thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Someone Yeah, that's a great, just so you all know, this is just, again, another, this is just the beginning of these conversations. This will be, the, the this virtual event has made it possible for us to reach an international audience. And so it makes sense now that we would start having more webinars, and we'll have these, and we'll have Facebook Lives and YouTube Lives, and we'll reach even more people that way. But right now, I think, this information is so wonderful and devastating all at the same time. I mean, that's how I felt. And when we met in 2016, we really didn't reconvene until this year. It takes a while to absorb the truth and the reality of what's happening with women, simply because they're either forced into marriage, or there's no legal marriage, or even if you are legally married, what's taken away from you. It's really, when you talk about widows being underserved, we're talking, these widows are underrepresented. They're not even believed when they do speak up. It's devastating. Lisa had a question. Are there any issues where their families or their tribes or their chiefs, as in their customs? Yeah. Is there any issues with them wanting to reverse this idea?
So that's what we're working on. And look, culture is really hard to change. It is a paradigm, and it's been there for centuries. And so to change culture is really a big ask. It's a paradigm shift. And we have to be very careful in how to do that. And lots of times it's the leaders of that culture that are perpetrating the culture and these violent practices. And lots of times they just don't know better. Honestly, once we start to educate them, they realize that this is really sort of wrong. But before then, it's just been ingrained, and they haven't been able to think of anything other than that. There's also a lot of taboo. So widows are forced to do this, and it's being done to them because they really truly believe that if they don't do this, something horrible will happen to them. And so we need to be able to open their eyes to see that, well, widows in the north of your country don't do this, and they're fine. Nothing happens to them. Or, well, this widow here in the South had this happen to her, and guess what? Her in-laws died before she did, or, something tragic happened to the people who perpetrated it. So we just have to work that. It's very difficult. I will say, over the course of this past week, that as widows have become more vocal, as they have become more empowered, they have stopped this, they have been more vocal against harmful traditional practices, and we're seeing a small decline, but not meaningful.
That's right. Everything that happens in this country, every change, every initiative we get approved, every addendum to every law, everything matters, because when we do it here in the US, these other countries will look and say, why did they do that? And then then we have other people helping do the work of education and awareness, people who can talk to other people on that same level. It's we are now talking to the Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration of Children and Families. Why? Because there's no office on widowhood. No. And why is that? Because no one has fought for it, right? Like that is what me and Heather do. When are we going to do that? Who do we have to talk to? How do we get this particular political person to actually walk it in? I mean, you have to go to Congress to get that passed. These are things I didn't know anything about, but what I understand now is they need help. Our policymakers actually need help. They don't know that it's happening. And so it's important that we bring them this information, because let me tell you, the majority of the people that Heather and I talk to, this is a common response. How did we miss this? I did not know.
I did not know. I never.
None of us, we didn't know either. But now we are together saying, hey, we have a more complete story here, and you can help, and you can help. And now we're a force. Like I was saying yesterday, we are a force for good. That,
we, we are
to
so powerful, and the amount of power that we have is untapped. We don't even understand it.
right,
But I
exactly.
think that working together, we'll be able to change the lives of widows, not only here, but everywhere.
It's true. And next year, we're going to the UN Commission on the Status of Women conference. And Heather's been there. She's more experienced. She's going to walk us in. She'll be able to speak on bigger platforms because she's ahead of us in making those connections. But then we also have different types of connections, and that survey that you filled out to be in this event, that's the kind of data we're going to take them, because when 500 widows, which we could easily get 5,000 responses too, but is 5,500 going to be that much different? It's like the evidence is there, right? So we now are the premier research population. And it used to be, oh, that's not true. Well, guess what? Got news for you. We have evidence that it is true, and right from your mouth, right? Enough of you, a force for good. So I have to give away this gift. Thank you so much, Heather. Oh my gosh, this is just the beginning. Don't worry. I knew that you guys would want more. And we're going to give you more, just not right now. And so we've got two winners of our Worcester bracelet to give out. Our customized Modern Widows Club, the Worcester. Heather, you know that's what we call ourselves, Widow Sisters. Candy Nelson and Christina Murphy. The two of you guys need to write support@modernwidowsclub.org. If you stayed till the end of the call, you got to stay to the end of the call to win. But you two ladies, if you'll write, we'll get you in touch, and we need your address so we can send you your gift. So thank you, Heather, so much. And this is the beginning of a great year of advocacy for both of us.
I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. Be well, be healthy. And I look forward to changing the world with you.
And the next time we're going to talk about how COVID-19 has changed everything, because that's a whole topic in its own. And we know that the majority of people who are dying are men. And we know that more than 100,000 new widows or more are in the world now. So we have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work.
About that next.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.